Okay, so welcome everybody. Thank you for being here. We have 4 amazing papers in this session. The first paper is by Jenna Myers on the future of training, vendor, and user co-production of new knowledge surrounding fast-changing digital technologies, followed by 3 other papers that I'll introduce after Jenna's presentation. So since we have 4 papers and I don't want to take too much time, I'm going to turn it over to Jenna, and I'll mute myself. And
great. And would you mind
yeah,
stop sharing the screen? I think I might be able to.
Right. Okay.
There we go. Okay. Hi, everyone. I was having some internet issues earlier, so I just pre-recorded the presentation and I'll share the video. But let me know if, okay, I'm clicking the share sound, so that should work properly. So here we go. Hi, everyone. I'm excited to present work based on an ethnography of a technology vendor that created and manages a digital monitoring technology for manufacturers. And I'll be discussing both the promise and unintended consequences for new training models that these types of vendors are using. Rather than emphasizing the role of vendors, much of the literature on work and organizations focuses on what happens during and after technologies are implemented within organizations. Specifically, processes of experimentation and accommodation during use are thought to explain how technologies change organizations. But there are reports of widespread failures of digital transformations, where users either can't or don't incorporate the technologies into their work. So what can be done about this? I pose here that it might be time to revive discussions of training. Since training, while it's flawed, it can help users develop organization-specific behaviors, routines, and skills. But much of our understanding about technology training, particularly vendor-provided training, is from generations of technologies that are much different and develop more slowly than do fast-changing digital technologies like the one I'll be discussing today. So I ask 2 research questions. Do users of fast-changing digital technologies develop knowledge under similar processes that are effective for more stable technologies? And if not, how can effective learning and training take place? To answer these questions, I draw on 2 literatures that discuss technology user knowledge development. First, the constructivist perspective conceptualizes knowledge as behaviors and routines that are incorporated into work. And here, knowledge development is enabled by technology frames that tie the technology to valued organizational goals, organizational environments that support psychological safety, and the use of complex technologies that require new organizational routines. This knowledge development takes place as users experiment with technologies during use and as they interact with managers and peers while doing so. For example, super users might be worker representatives that assist with implementation and training. The functionalist perspective is generally older, and it views knowledge more in terms of codifiable skills. It acknowledges that it's difficult for training to be situated in the context of use, so it focuses on well-articulated training materials that can be distributed to users, typically prior to or during implementation. And this formal training can be delivered by either managers or vendors, as well as ongoing coaching by managers and peers. But neither of these literatures has really considered how user knowledge development is accomplished for fast-changing digital technologies, which have different and challenging characteristics that I'll be discussing. So this paper largely draws on 9 months of data that I collected as part of a larger ethnography focused on a technology vendor that I call ProdTech. And again, ProdTech created and manages a cloud-based platform that displays real-time data to manufacturers, including machine shops. I began by following ProdTech's technology development process. And as I did, this concept of customer education became very interesting to me. And this is essentially ProdTech's term for training. It was something that was just starting at ProdTech, and I took the opportunity to follow it by meeting with the customer education manager weekly for several months, as well as attending team meetings for customer education and user feedback calls that the team did with their customers. I followed and analyzed data from 4 customer education projects. 3 were mainly targeted to managers because they were focused on training for managers that used this web app to analyze data. 1 training project was targeted to workers who use touchscreen tablets to interact with the platform to add and contextualize data right at their machines. And I noticed that while ProdTech marketed its platform as easy to use and easy to install, they began taking on an intensive training role to help their customers manage the frequent changes that were made to the platform. And this was sometimes as often as weekly or monthly. So as ProdTech scaled, they wanted to find a way to help their customers understand these changes without needing to interact individually with each one of them. And as these training efforts began, I noticed that they seemed very different from vendor-provided training described in the literature. And this is because ProdTech's technology is different from the technologies on which this older literature is based. In particular, I show on this table, compared to traditional software systems, ProdTech's cloud-based system has more intense vendor involvement. And as I mentioned, changes much more frequently using this continuous improvement model. But the communities of practice literature implies that changing technological and environmental conditions like these will likely change how learning and training is accomplished. It also implies that this kind of shift is difficult and that new training models need to be aligned with users' modes of learning. So in this paper, I posit that there's one identifiable training model for more stable technologies and another for faster changing technologies like ProdTech. And the main contribution of this paper is to outline these two different models and explore what characterizes the new one by looking at what ProdTech did. So I find that in the new model, it's characterized by new training tools, targets, and timing. No longer does training consist only of traditional materials delivered to new users at implementation, but modern tools like self-paced online learning tools that can be delivered to new and existing users throughout use. So the customer education manager at ProdTech described these new tools by saying, in ProdTech Academy, there are videos, photos, quizzes. This is the platform that they created. For customers, the vision is to have a really modular experience. Everyone is different and customization is really important. Somebody may reject parts and track quality in the worker-facing tablet, and others may not use these optional features. So it's create your own adventure. To put this new model in place also required vendors to engage in new practices. While traditionally vendors used to codify technology-related skills and deliver training to users at designated times, these new practices require ongoing co-production. So for example, ProdTech leveraged ongoing customer feedback to develop training content. And this included asking customers about ideal delivery methods and points of confusion in existing training materials. So the customer education manager said, a customer had our FAQ articles printed out and she was showing them to me. She showed me what she missed and what made her have to integrate all of her machines with ProdTech again. These customer conversations provide so much more than you would ever get from internal conversations. And so all of these practices resulted in some pretty successful training campaigns for ProdTech, which were continually iterated and updated as they learned more. But there are also unintended consequences to the new training model. In particular, the old and new training models are each more effective for particular types of occupations. Older training practices, I argue, were more suitable for frontline workers like machine operators who learn through master apprentice systems, since training typically relied on materials like protocols and documentation that were delivered in particular times and places. ProdTech did, they're more suitable for independent professionals. So these self-paced online training tools, they work well for professionals like engineers who might need to investigate a particular issue and dig as deeply as they want into it on their own time. So this new training model that ProdTech created was not as effective for frontline workers. For a number of reasons, ProdTech had fewer opportunities to build knowledge around worker use cases and needs for the technology. There were more barriers to transfer knowledge to workers, given how controlled workers' environments were. And the tools and techniques common to cloud-based softwares, like the use of the online learning platforms, they were less translatable to worker contexts. Many of the manufacturing workers didn't have work email addresses or consistent access to computers at work, for instance, so they couldn't take advantage of these tools. And these barriers played out when ProdTech wanted to trigger a training video or an interactive guide on the touchscreen tablets that they had. But the customer education manager said about those ideas, I think the barrier to entry would be engineering or technical resources and the ability to trigger that video on the tablet at the right moment for different shifts. Every company has different shift times. So in the end, these barriers meant that less adequate training reached frontline workers, despite ProdTech recognizing that it was important for workers to understand the what and the why and the how of their technology in order to add value to it. So to conclude, I conceptualize user knowledge development by combining these two perspectives and suggesting that technology users must develop skills, behaviors, and routines to incorporate technologies into their work. I show that users develop such knowledge by when training aligns with users' modes of learning, and that it may be, in particular, difficult to develop training for fast-changing digital technologies that can be effectively delivered to frontline workers. So develop a set of practices that vendors of fast-changing digital technologies can use for training, specifically that training can be iterative, co-produced with users, and rely on tools and techniques from the wider software field. While there are barriers to delivering this training to workers, this new model does have benefits. So these practices allow training to be somewhat situated within multiple contexts of use and adaptive to the rapid changes that are common with these technologies. In sum, fast-changing digital technologies like these are being increasingly implemented in worker-heavy industries like manufacturing, healthcare, hospitality, and retail. These technologies present the opportunity for new training models, which can be led by vendors and co-produced with users, and which help users adjust to rapid technology changes. But providing effective training for workers is difficult, and for new reasons. So in order to be effective, these new training models must account for workers' traditional ways of learning. Otherwise, training is at risk of becoming yet another aspect of technology development and use that risks leaving workers further behind as we move into the future of work. So thank you, and I look forward to future conversations.
Thank you, Jenna. So we have about 5 minutes for Q&A. So I can go ahead and maybe ask the first question to Jenna. So I'm curious if there are any challenges in evaluating the training outcomes consistently among the users, and also, yeah, I guess that will be my first question.
Yes, and so that's in particular an area of this paper that's still very much under development because the technology vendor themselves kind of analyzed their different training campaigns in different ways. They looked at the effects of the training campaigns on the type of support tickets that were submitted. So they wanted to know if they provided a training around a certain topic, whether their customers submitted less requests for help. They looked at whether the customers used the particular areas of the product that they were being trained on more effectively. But since the managers and professionals were using the web app and the workers were using the tablets, they had to kind of track them differently. And they were far less effective in tracking the effects on worker training, because this was one of the barriers, that individual workers were actually not set up to be tracked on an individual basis within their system. So ProdTech couldn't even determine kind of what actions within the technology were taken by an individual worker. They could just see what were taken on an individual tablet, which might be accessed by multiple different workers. So that in itself was even a challenge for them in delivering and evaluating this training, and that was kind of differentially felt when it was targeted to managers versus workers. So all that to say, I'm trying to deal with that in this paper and really present some evidence to show that certain campaigns were more effective than others, and I'm still considering how to do that. In addition to just framing that evaluation itself was something that was difficult when directed to workers.
That's really interesting. Thank you. Any other questions?
I have a question. So that was interesting. I may have missed it. This was ethnographic.
Yep.
So how did you do that? Particularly the times you're doing it seemed like it might have been a challenge.
Yes. So this, like I mentioned quickly, this was part of a larger ethnography. And so I had received access to this vendor before the pandemic started, and had a prior relationship with them. And they transitioned all of their work onto virtual platforms. They use Zoom, they use Slack once the lockdowns happened. And so that was how I started tracking their work, particularly around this topic, was just through the channels that they themselves used. But it did present some barriers in terms of, getting some customer data, because they probably would have conducted their work differently if they had been able to go visit the manufacturers that were using their technology. I'm sure they would have done more customer visits that I could have then observed myself. But we work with what we had during this time, and it was definitely a very interesting way to do research. But it's, in this particular topic, it's nice because they used so many different platforms to do this work, including tracking usage data and creating these these training modules in the first place. So in this particular topic, I think it was, I mean, maybe even potentially beneficial to be able to kind of just have online access and follow their work as they were doing it virtually. So pros and cons.
Cool, thank you.
Thank you, Jenna. You're hit 2:15, so I'm gonna thank you so much for the presentation and interesting work and for the questions. So the next paper is by Xincheng and Eric Jincheng Huang, entitled Labor Misallocation with Precautionary Saving.
Thank you for joining the session, and thank you, Yahi, for the introduction. So I actually changed the title a little bit. Now it's called a Precautionary Mismatch. So my name is Xincheng. I'm a PhD student at the University of Pennsylvania, and this is joint work with my classmate, Eric. So the question we are after is about the labor market mismatch. It's actually pervasive and costly. It's costly both from an individual worker perspective view or the aggregate perspective view. So for an individual worker, labor market mismatch may depress wage potential.
Okay, hello. I'm Greg Lyon, and I'm at Georgetown in the business school and the policy school. So hence the kind of title that intersects both business and policy a little bit. So job security, partisanship, and environmental regulation is the paper.
Greg, your slides are kind of in the bottom corner of the screen. I don't think a full screen worked.
Bring your shared window to the front. Oh, okay, okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Let's try this. Is that better? Okay.
Yep.
Okay, so I'm Greg Lyon, and this paper is on job security, partisanship, and environmental regulation. Here we have 3 articles. The top one's about kind of US announcing rollback of auto pollution rules, kind of a key policy related to climate change. The second one on the left-hand side talks about the growing partisan divide in the environment, which is essentially that Democrats and Republicans are quite polarized in their views of environmental regulation, such that Democrats are typically very supportive and Republicans are typically highly opposed to environmental regulation. And the last one is actually kind of the core of what I want to talk about today, which is just an article on UAW that had a deal with Mack trucks to maintain job security in Lehigh Valley, which is a kind of deindustrialized area of Pennsylvania. And my argument basically is that job security is actually an important component that intersects with both partisanship and environmental regulation support, so attitudes about environmental regulation. And moreover, it's kind of a question that I'm asking, which is work related to environmental policy, and how does work intersect with politics, especially partisanship, as it relates to environmental policy? And so we know environmental policy is a very highly partisan issue. We have, again, high support among Democrats, pretty low support for environmental regulation among Republicans. And we can see this in various ways. I'm sure you're quite familiar with it. This is just kind of the growing divide on public opinion about environmental policies and climate change. And we know that Americans tend to rely quite heavily on partisanship as a guide for an informational cue about where to stand on policy issues. So we know that partisanship is quite important for shaping people's opinions about policy, including environmental regulation. But my argument is basically that partisanship is important, but I think it interacts with job security, and these effects are not always what we would expect, and they're kind of, in a sense, depolarizing in the environmental landscape, such that Democrats tend to generally hold kind of high pro-environmental regulation attitudes, and job security might have no effect there. Whereas Republicans tend to hold low levels of support for pro-environmental policy. And here I think there's more space for opinion change. And I think the mechanism of opinion change is basically job security. When Republicans feel a greater sense of job security, then they're more likely to support environmental regulation. And I'm going to show this with both cross-sectional and panel data. An additional finding is that Democrats become less supportive when they have increased levels of job insecurity when they lose their job. So I'm not going to go into all the details because I think we're trying to keep it to 10 minutes. But basically, environmental policy has and attitudes about environmental policy has kind of focused on economic conditions, and when the economy is doing worse, people might become less supportive of environmental regulation. Whereas on the other hand, kind of political researchers look mainly at partisanship. So I look at individual experience of job security and how that intersects with partisanship. Sorry, moving a little quick because I realize the slides are longer than I anticipated in a short amount of time. So how do I measure job security? So this is something that job security self-reported tends to be kind of unstable. And so instead I use an objective proxy for job security, which is union membership. We know union members report higher levels of job security, and we know just legally and empirically, a union contract provides a greater level of job security. And so we know it increases control over work and schedule, employment stability, health and safety, and so on. So I use this as a measure of job security to see whether it has any effect on environmental regulation attitudes. So moving quickly, I use data from the Cooperative Congressional Election Study. And this is a large survey that's done every 2 years. And I merge multiple years, 2010, 2012, 2014, 16, 18, with a different kind of environmental policy attitude item there. And then I also use panel data, which I'll talk about at the end, which is from 2010 and 2012, and asked respondents at 2010, and then asked the same exact respondents in 2012, the same question. And so I look at, do Republicans who unionize in that period of time change their attitudes about environmental policy regulation? So the main dependent variable I'm interested in is whether is a 5-point scale in prioritizing jobs or environment. Basically, on one end, it says we should always prioritize jobs, not the environment. The other end is that we should prioritize environmental regulation, even at the expense of jobs. And the main predictor I'm interested in is job security. And again, I'm measuring this with union membership, which is just a 0-1 binary variable. And then also partisanship. So self-identified party affiliation is a 7-point scale that runs from strong Democrat to strong Republican. And what I'm interested in is the interaction between union membership and party. And so here we expect it to be positive, such that job security has a positive effect on pro-environmental attitudes at higher levels of partisanship, which I'm measuring as a kind of ordinal scale. And we have a bunch of controls in there as well that we know can affect attitudes about environmental policy. And so the takeaway is that I do find an interaction, and here's just kind of the table version, but then I also plot it. And so what are we looking at here? This is the effect of union membership, the conditional effects at each level of partisanship, so running from strong Democrat to a strong Republican, on pro-environmental policy attitudes. How am I doing on time, actually? Good. And so as you see, the confidence intervals, when they overlap 0, that means there's no effect. And so as you move from Democrats, there's no effect of union membership, is that kind of ceiling effect. They're supportive and they can't really get much higher. Whereas among Republicans, union members who are Republicans tend to be more supportive of environmental regulation than union members than Republicans who are not union members. And I argue that this is job security that provides kind of a basis for greater support for environmental regulation. And so There's another way to do this, which I use just a different set of items in different years, different samples, 2014, 2016, 2018. And I scale those 4 items together, you see there, whether they support EPA regulation of carbon, whether they support increasing MPG requirements for cars, use of renewable fuels, and Clean Air Act. Scale this together into a single measure, just to see the same exact, the same exact model. And the results are similar to the other one, which was about kind of jobs and environment as an important policy issue. And the results here again are pretty similar, except you see significance at the independent level. And I looked at this as a nonlinear, partisanship as a nonlinear variable as well. And the results are similar. You can debate whether we could treat this kind of 1 through 7 scale as a linear variable, but for the time being, I do. But basically, the idea here is that union members who are Republican union members are more supportive of pro-environmental policy than non-members. And so lastly, the question is whether this is actually causal. So like, is it unionizing that has that effect on Republicans' attitudes about environmental policy? And I say it's job security, which I'm calling unionization. So if you get more job security, you unionize, you're a Republican, do you become more supportive of environmental policy regulation than you were prior to unionizing the same person? So to do this, I used panel data from 2010 to 2012. So basically in 2010, 12,000 respondents were asked the exact same questions that they were asked again in 2012. And so what I want to know is the people who were in 2010 were not part of a union, and then in 2012 were part of a union, the Republicans particularly, did their attitudes about environment policy, which they are also asked in 2010 and 2012, change? Okay. And so I find that they do. And so here's just a kind of simplified the regression plot into a kind of dot whisker plot. And so you can see on the left-hand side, it's Democrats. On the right-hand side, it's Republicans. So I run the models separately for the panel analysis. And the kind of dot whisker at the top is the effect of joining a union between 2010 and 2012. And its effect on like support for pro-environmental regulation. And so Democrats, there was no movement. If you see the blue line it goes over the 0, so there's no effect. Democrats who become union members don't become any more supportive of environmental regulation. Republicans, there is an effect. As we see, it's a positive impact that when among Republicans who unionized between 2010 and 2012, they also became more supportive of environmental regulation. Interestingly, and wasn't part of my original argument in theory, but I'm working it in, is actually that Democrats became less supportive when they became unemployed between 2010 and 2012. So such that rising kind of work status insecurity for Democrats reduced support among Democrats, and greater security among Republicans measured by unionization increased support. In that sense, you have that depolarization where you're kind of getting, in a way, closer together. The takeaway would be that unionization and less unemployment would be generally better for pro-environmental regulation, or to increase regulation attitudes, more support for regulation of environmental policy generally. But I want to just make sure I finish. So the implications are kind of speak to political behavior as well as environmental policy. And there's an important role for labor policy and work. I think, work and workplace employment experience is an overlooked mechanism that may affect kind of workplace about environmental attitudes and opinion change. But this is actually happening. We see this talked about now much more with climate change and kind of job security and job creation. And I think that's a very important element to the discussion about environmental regulation. Thank you.
Thank you, Gregory. So I'll open up for questions.
Greg, this is interesting. I might miss it. I have a conceptual question. So should I think of unionship as like equivalent to job security, or should I think of unionship as a third factor that both contribute to job security and environmental, promoting environmental concerns. So how should I think of it?
Yeah, I don't measure job security directly. So I don't have measures that have in that data set anything about job security. So I do treat union membership as job security. So whether we want to say that union membership affects job security, which affects environmental regulation attitudes, or union membership is job security and that affects environmental regulation. So it does have implications for the causal arrow. But I'd be curious about, so anyway, that's the kind of, I don't measure it directly. So that's something that I'm looking for some other sources of data that might have both measures of job security and environmental attitudes. The issue is that job security is a difficult thing to measure. People tend to just say, I'm always going to lose my job. I could lose my job at any minute, whereas union membership is like an empirical, objective set part of job security. So we know typically, you can't be fired. It's not at will when you have a union contract and so on. So that's kind of it's something that I'm working through. But thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. So in the interest of time, I'll turn the table over to James Kim or Jeongrock Kim.
Yeah, hello.
Yeah.
Sorry, I haven't used Zoom. I'm not entirely sure how I could share my screen.
You haven't used Zoom?
I use Microsoft Teams, so.
Oh, okay. All right.
There's like a black bar underneath,
Yeah.
and you'll see a share screen option.
It's in green letters. It says share screen. I glossed over it. Could someone just give me a thumbs up if I'm sharing my screen? Is it?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, cool. Okay, hi guys. My name is Jeongrock, or you guys can call me James. That's easier. I just to introduce myself, up until about a year ago, I was a graduate student at the Center for Industrial Relations and Human Resources at UFT, and I read that Dr. Myers will be joining as faculty. So on behalf of all MIR HRs, welcome aboard. But I have since graduated and I'm now a consulting analyst at an HR research and advisory firm. And this paper is sort of my last remaining appendage to the world of academia. So I'm very excited to be here today to present this paper to you all. To frame our discussion, I just wanted to give a little background or context of our investigation. So our project actually started as a consulting engagement with Canada's largest telecommunications company. And they found from their annual employee surveys that when employees had to venture outside of their immediate teams and collaborate with somebody outside of their departments or functions, they had a lot of trouble. And this was especially so when they were done in informal contexts. And so we were engaged to help them navigate through this challenge. And once the engagement was over, we turned our findings into a review of the literature, investigating 2 research questions. What are the barriers to informal cross-functional collaboration, and how can organizations do it better? So to go over the key constructs that we investigate, the first one being functional heterogeneity, which essentially points to the diversity of knowledge and expertise that comes from someone's functional capacity. So for example, someone working in labor relations is functionally heterogeneous from those working in IT or finance. And the term double-edged sword has been used to juxtapose both the benefits and costs of functional heterogeneity. On the one hand, it enables access to deeper and richer information such that it produces more innovative outcomes. But on the other hand, functionally heterogeneous members have divergent attitudes and approaches to tasks, which can often lead to unproductive forms of conflict on both task and relation-related dimensions. Second construct is informal collaboration, and while it might be a novel construct for many, it's actually a very commonplace practice in the workplace. It's defined as spontaneous and opportunistic forms of collaboration, and so far, several studies have examined this in the context of co-located employees, but no study, to our knowledge, has investigated the influence of diversity of member characteristics, such as their functional expertise, on informal collaboration. And so we address this gap in knowledge, and to do so, we operationalize informal cross-functional collaboration, or ICFC, which I'll be referring to for the remainder of this presentation as spontaneous and transient collaborations between members of different functions. At the crux of our argument, we argue that functional heterogeneity is a threat to ICFC. There are several ways an organizations can foster effective collaboration in traditional forms, like doing things like aligning goals or actively engaging in knowledge sharing, facilitating prolonged positive interactions with collaborators. But in the case of informal cross-functional collaboration, unfortunately, they are more or less not as applicable. And that's because informal collaborations are spontaneous and opportunistic. The goals of entire units can be shifted to appropriate short-lived collaboration. And similarly, organizational change like creating a culture of collaboration or openness, this requires time, resources, and effort, not to mention the complications that arise with change management. And lastly, prolonged interactions belies the very nature of ICFC. And so thus we argue that functional heterogeneity poses an especially large threat to effective collaboration in this transient form, as it not only maintains the cost of cross-functional work, but is also a greater challenge to navigate. So you could see our theoretical model here, and you can see the initial relationship between functional heterogeneity and the barriers to ICFC, which I'll be going over shortly. But you could also see two moderators, the first one being structural and cognitive silos, which exacerbates the issues when they permeate within the organization. And going in the other direction, you have alleviatory organizational efforts, essentially what organizations can do in terms of policies or NHRM practices that can attenuate the difficulties that come by virtue of functional heterogeneity. So jumping into the nuts and bolts of the barriers. First, trust, as you can imagine, is an essential part in promoting positive collaborative relationships. But developing trust takes time and frequent interactions, which contradicts the very nature of ICFC. And so we first proposed that functional heterogeneity will be negatively related to trust between collaborators. And similarly, second barrier is communication. And some things that contribute to this are the physical layout of the workspace. So the virtual remote working environments that we're all currently living notwithstanding, organizations tend to sit members of the same units close to one another. And while that makes a lot of logistical sense, it takes away from those valuable face-to-face interactions that is much needed to develop relationships among team members of different functions. Other problems like task processes and jargon specific to each function that don't evoke the same meaning in different contexts, and at the most heightened level, negative appraisals and outgroup biases can hinder effective communication. And trust and communication, as it turns out, are two very essential elements in network formation. And as I mentioned, conflict on relational and task-related dimensions, preventing close and trustful relationships, can have a negative impact on relational capital. And relational capital it refers to a member's ability to leverage his or her networks within an organization and for successful task completion. And so third, we propose that functional heterogeneity will have a negative impact on the extent of members' networks as well as relational capital. And this is particularly important because the literature is fairly consistent in saying that your ability to collaborate, especially cross-functionally, is directly commensurate with the extent of your networks within an organization. Now jumping into silos, we draw from social categorization process from Pashfal, and this sort of line of literature serves as the theoretical underpinning for in and out group biases that we're so familiar with. And this posits that people identify and categorize themselves into groups with whom they share key characteristics. And in organizations, similarities in task-related dimensions are highly likely to evoke this type of categorization due to its importance to task completion and job performance. And so with members forming their own in and out group biases and conflicts may arise, and these groups may start to seek and offer information among each other, leading to structural silos. Also, you can have consolidation of social dynamics in such a way that interactions are limited to those within the members in group, or there can even be an over-identification within their own in group, which leads to cognitive silos, or in another term for it is silo mentality. And so what impacts do silos have? Well, first, trust. In-group favoritism and depersonalized trust, which entails giving trust to someone not for their competencies or knowledge and skills and abilities, but for their shared membership in a specific group, can lead to amplified effects of social categorization. Communication, the inability or even the unwillingness to bridge the communication or the cultural barriers can lead to further breakdowns in communication, poor knowledge sharing, cultural tension, and environmental competition. If and when the environment of competition permeates through an organization, units can very well begin to prioritize the resources and goal accomplishment of their own units above even that of the organization. Finally, networks, as you can imagine, silos are very isolating of employees. It could restrict information flow and exchange as well as relationship development. So I've so far laid out a very grim and pessimistic outlook for informal cross-functional collaboration. And so the next question that needs to be asked is, what can organizations do to alleviate these problems? So to give a high-level overview of each of them, the first one is rewards and recognition. It could be tangible monetary rewards or recognition of positive collaborative behaviors, but so long as they're well communicated, transparent, and widely implemented, and if employees can be expected to be rewarded or recognized for these behaviors, they can actually be a very powerful driver in behavioral change. But insofar as the impact of rewards and recognition go, they're actually preceded in importance by the role of trust. So as I mentioned, trust is such an essential element in enabling collaboration. It makes sense that fostering trust across units is an especially potent enabler of informal cross-functional collaboration. Leaderships, particularly those oriented towards facilitating collaboration and exchange of information, are very effective. Two such styles have been identified. They are participative and transformational leadership. And finally, internal networking opportunities. So whereas social categorization creates relational distance between members, giving employees the opportunity to create common grounds on elements discrete from work. So like in the same sports teams or having similar hobbies can start to break down those barriers. And these are the propositions tied to those programs. And finally, jumping into the discussion, we introduce a delineated form of collaboration, which hasn't been investigated in the literature. And we also illustrate the role of functional heterogeneity, which is a core element of cross-functional collaboration in impacting its effectiveness of informal collaboration. Practical implications, because organizations are increasingly turning to amalgamating and integrating the knowledge of this diverse workforce to remain competitive, it stands to reason that a deep understanding of how this takes place informally and how it can be made more or less effective through their HRM programs and practices can have immense practical implications for firms. And finally, review of the literature. We lack empirical data, and we focus solely on task-related diversity and not on any surface-level immutable forms of diversity, which can very well have an impact. And so we implore future studies to springboard off of our study to begin empirical testing of ICFC as a construct. And these studies can, if so they choose to take a more integrated conceptualization to diversity. And finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the role of the COVID-19 pandemic. Collaboration through virtual means has never been more important than it is now. And the role of informal collaboration through virtual means may be a very fruitful area for future research. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Any questions to James?
I have a question. Hi, James, and thanks for the welcome. I feel your pain with switching now to Microsoft Teams. This is an interesting topic because, like you say, like the things that we would expect to promote formal collaboration or collaboration within functions don't seem to work here. But I'm kind of wondering about the genesis of your project in the first place. What is the benefits of informal collaboration across functions aren't immediately apparent to me. So I'm wondering what the organization hoped to actually gain out of this, if they gave you any specific examples or reasons that they were pushing this.
Yeah, so to give a little background about informal collaboration, I'll answer your question and add a little bit more about the literature. So the firm that we consulted, they were concerned that while when they have formally mandated these product teams to form with members across functions, employees work really well with one another. But as you can imagine, informal collaboration is a very widespread practice in the workplace. And this can entail something as simple as going up to somebody in finance and asking something for a document. And when employees have difficulties doing this, it can create very minor, it can be very minor hindrances in their day-to-day workflows. But while they are minor, they can add up to create more complications in the wider picture. And in the literature, informal collaboration actually is seen as more effective when diverse employees are working on complex projects. And so they were hoping to tap into that a little bit more so than they had right now, because again, as I mentioned, their employees were having a lot of difficulties doing this. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, it's really helpful to even hear an example of what informal collaboration means and how it could be something as simple as that. So, so that kind of expands my thinking there. Yeah, thank you.
Are there any other questions for James? If not, I'll ask one question for Xincheng because we didn't have Q&A for your presentation. I was just wondering how stable do you think the mismatch between the employees and the firm? Because I would imagine the employees, especially in the lower wage employees, would be more eager to transform their skill sets so that they would fit, so those would fit better with the firm and therefore produce higher utility out of it.
That's an excellent question. In the benchmark model I showed today, we don't incorporate any learning by doing a human capital accumulation. So basically, in the benchmark framework, skills of worker skills and firm skill requirements are fixed. So the skill mismatch will stay forever until they dissolve the match. But in the extended version, we also add this on-the-job learning in the sense that the longer you stay in the job, the worker is going to become more similar to the firm so that the mismatch is gradually becoming smaller and smaller. But I think that's a very good direction to further explore.
I see. Thank you so much for your insights. So we are at 3 on the dot. Thank you so much for presenting all your interesting papers. It's an honor to serve as a chair for the papers that highlight different opportunities and challenges associated with the new nature of work. And I wish you best with the rest of the LERA.
Thank you.
Thank you, Yahi, and good to see you all.
Thank you, Bernadette.